again for joining us. This is the Black education experience in the United States. And if you are watching, hopefully you have watched all of the series leading up to this, which is our final episode in this series that we hope you're getting a lot of good stuff from. Testaments of courage, freedom, resilience, and dignity. The purpose of this series has been to help educators, administrators in education have a deeper understanding and appreciation for the movement, Black Lives Matter movement, and the concerns and calls for racial justice across this country that we've heard over the last year now, as it's come forward. And so we're going to use this episode as an opportunity to kind of reflect back on the previous episodes, seeking to tease out some of the learnings that I'm hoping folks will take away from this series. And so with that, we're going to jump right in. Calling this lesson, Making Black Lives Matter in Schools and on the Campus. We call it that because, of course, you know, what we're experiencing in many of our schools at all levels of education, from kindergarten to higher ed, is a continued lack of concern, respect, appreciation, and understanding, not just for the Black experience in this country, but also for Black students and Black professionals. The subtitle of the series seeks to highlight those aspects of the African American experience that speaks not just to Black people's humanity, but to all of our humanity. And the hope is that by recognizing in the Black experience in education these standards and you know, clearly indicating across episode to episode, all of these values show up: courage, freedom, resilience, and dignity. And so beginning with the first episode, next slide. The lingua franca of freedom, the African invention of African American English. We start here with the fundamental piece of appreciation for not just what Africans achieved in the development of what is called African American English, but that episode was primarily meant to help to serve as a corrective. This map is a map of the various language families that exist across the continent of Africa. The language family in the red is meant to indicate that language family from which what we understand as African American English actually emerges from. And so that episode sought to clarify and correct a, calling it a misunderstanding is being nice, but it is in fact an act of oppression when you fail to acknowledge a people's language and instead refer to it as a broken form of another language. So here are the things that we want to highlight: that with respect to education, diversity is indispensable. A people's humanity is evidenced through their culture. The culture of Black people is the testament, if you will, to the humanity of Black people. It is how every community expresses their humanity. It can only be expressed through one's culture and cultural identity. Therefore, to honor a people is to honor their culture. The contrary, to dishonor a people's culture is indeed to dishonor their humanity. And so with respect to the Black experience in education, we have here at this first start an appreciation for this fundamental act of humanity on the part of African people who found themselves captured and placed in the chains of slavery, a reality that denied their humanity outright. this act of developing a language and a means to communicate to themselves, a means to communicate to the people who enslave them, as well as a reservoir, if you will, of their identity. The second lesson, outlaw education. Black education as resistance to institutional racism sought to speak about the ways in which Black folks during slavery saw education as a pathway to freedom and a means to outwit the system of slavery itself. It's Frederick Douglass who said that to deny education to any people is one of the greatest crimes against human nature. It is to deny them the means of freedom and the rightful pursuit of happiness, and to defeat the very end of their being. Douglass, as someone who was once enslaved himself, who fought his way to freedom and had to make good use of the meager education he was able to achieve while in chains, speaks to the ways in which the systems of white supremacy at that time sought to control the lives of Black people by the denial of education, as we see today and through these lessons. That denial, that third point there, that educational discrimination, the denial of equal opportunity within education, continues the oppressive logic of white supremacy. Educational equality is the key to freedom. Black people have always prized education as the key to freedom and prosperity. Education was outlawed as a means to control. And as I said, with respect to discrimination, that indeed what we talk about when we say in this country that, we live in a meritocracy, that is, that by now should be clearly understood as a myth, indeed as a lie, that a meritocracy requires educational equality. The third lesson, defining freedom, emancipation, and the creation of the public school, was a critical intervention in U.S. history, in that most of us, overwhelmingly, most of us have no knowledge of the crucial role Black people played in the establishment of compulsory education in this country. This lesson sought to not just correct that narrative that often sees or places Black people in a position of receiving the benefits of the system or handouts and those kinds of things, not having the capacity to do for themselves, not having the capacity to or the intellect or the creativity to not just imagine possibility, but to execute possibility into reality. As Du Bois, in his magnum opus, Black Reconstruction in America, identifies, he dedicated an entire chapter to this point. States the first great mass movement for public education at the expense of the state in the South came from Negroes. Many leaders before the war had advocated general education, but few had been listened to. Schools for indigents and paupers were supported here and there and more or less spasmodically. Some states had elaborate plans, but they were not carried out. Indeed, public education for all at public expense was, in the South, a Negro idea. Black self-determination advances democracy. In that lesson, we learned that in developing public schools in post-war United States, post-Civil War, African Americans assured compulsory education for working class and poor white folks too. The denial of Black achievement is racism's intention. It is intentional that most folks in this country have no knowledge of this critical aspect of U.S. history. This is not just, Black history. We're going to talk about that distinction later. But this is U.S. history. You cannot tell the story of the United States properly, appropriately, without including this chapter in that story. Yet, So the denial of Black achievement is racism's intention. It enables folk to continue to walk around believing that Black people are incapable, when indeed Black people have all capacity and have shown it against the odds. It creates a false notion of white superiority that cannot stand, and we see this time and again. Every generation has a clear example of white people walking the earth believing in their superiority, only to be met with defeat on many levels at the hands and minds of Black people. Black liberation has not been rooted in revenge, but has been advanced toward and fueled by freedom. It has in fact benefited all people. Every generation, this is a reality. And yet we still have to contend with the fears and fragilities of white folks in powerful positions. The fourth lesson: education is a civil right, resisting the resegregation of public schools. Of the episodes, this one sought to do something a little different in that rather than kind of work through a timeline or pick out a particular episode in history, my intention was to kind of capture the entirety of that period and also use it as a barometer to our present moment. The general thesis, if you will, for that episode states that the engine for each form of institutional racism one could name, whether we're talking about police brutality, mass incarceration, employment or housing discrimination, is oiled by the discriminations Black people have experienced in the fields of educational access and educational attainment. To state it the other way, that were we to actually live in a society where Black people, now again, we're focusing on the Black experience here, but this is applicable to any other non-white community in this country, that if we in fact lived in a society where educational access and attainment were made available to all people, then the concerns of mass incarceration, the realities, I should say, of mass incarceration and police brutality, employment and housing discrimination would likely not be as they are, if at all. So if you have not seen that episode, I highly encourage you to check it out. This episode also lifted up the courage and highlighted the courage of everyday African Americans who, during the civil rights movement, really risked their lives to achieve a measure of opportunity to push forward the work of justice for Black people during the civil rights era in ways that clearly demonstrated their capacity to look beyond their immediate needs and concerns. Black courage is ethical and selfless, as evidenced in U.S. history. Black movements for equity and justice are led by actors who are motivated by more than their own concerns. We see this in the story of Ruby Bridges, where her family, literally deliberating whether or not to pursue integrating the school, having a clear understanding of the risks involved, and would actually experience some of that play out in their lives. Yet they did it, understanding that they were acting in a way that would widen the opportunities for others beyond their own selves. Courage is not the absence. And so by their example, we learn, and the example of many others, courage is not the absence of fear, but the presence of conviction. The courage of Black people is most evidenced in their fortitude and faith in the rightness of their cause. And by unlocking the change of generational poverty begins with legislation that repairs past harm. That piece is a lesson that our nation has yet to truly learn as we continue to enact reformative measures that fail to get at this generation's deep levels of poverty. The fifth lesson, the previous lesson, titled The Revelation of Black Studies from Protest to Empowerment, sought to look at and to hold up as a mirror to our present day what led to the development of Black studies, which was, in fact, to U.S. history, the longest student strike that was the result of actions taken against Black students in their effort to learn about and to organize around the interest that they had at that time, what is known as the Black Power movement. What we also sought to address was the long-standing demands of students then with respect to students today, African-American students, and we looked at, and kind of compared that period to our period with intention to see to what degree advances have occurred and where the gaps still exist. Certainly most, probably most is a bit of a stretch, but there are a number of schools in our nation today, colleges, where one can, either enroll in or benefit from or get a degree in African American studies or courses and the like. Yet the issues of our day have more to do with student loan debt, as African Americans are, as a consequence of all the things that we taught in the lessons prior, are saddled with the need to take out loans at a greater rate than their white counterparts. And it's as a consequence of the discrimination that African Americans continue to experience in their on the college campus, are often met with the inability to obtain the degree, which leads then to often defaulting on their loans at a greater rate as well. And so these concerns cannot be addressed merely by assuring the presence of African American studies on campuses. The work has to proceed and address these other more immediate concerns as well. The takeaways from this lesson include the point that inclusion is the act of recognition. Indeed, what this episode spoke to was the fact that white violence is often the spark that leads to Black organized resistance. And thus, white violence in itself is the ultimate means of repression in a racist system that when Black folks have historically, and even to this day, as we've witnessed in just this last year with the development or the escalation of Black Lives Matter movement, we have seen this play out, that white violence is a denial of Black humanity. It is the ultimate denial of Black humanity. In fact, it's Black death, leads to the killing, the murder, the violation of Black life. The Black resistance then to white violence is in itself an affirmation of Black humanity. Black self-affirmation is a public service, in essence, to other oppressed communities, as we saw in that lesson where Asian American students there in San Francisco, Latinx students there in San Francisco and Berkeley, also began to organize around their own concerns as a consequence of being inspired by what they witnessed from African American students. Solidarity is the collective act of a community bearing witness to justice. That when I'm able to see in you the same aspirations that I carry for myself, then we can work together and achieve justice or measure of justice for all. And so since our last episode, I've learned that Connecticut, in the spirit of that episode, has become the first state to require high schools to offer Black and Latinx studies that will begin and commence in the fall of 2022. The governor there, in initiating this move, Ned Lamont, stated that this was long overdue, and indeed it is. As these lessons here and our effort here has indicated, that when speaking about the African American experience in the United States, we are indeed speaking about the experience of the United States. That no community that has been here in this country for this long can ever be effectively marginalized or their story discounted to the footnotes of its own history. African Americans are the makers of U.S. history. Thus, it is important, that all students in the classroom, in learning about this country, its systems, its history, its various, aspects of it, of what makes the United States what it is today, ought to be taught not just about these different communities, but also be taught from the perspective of those communities as they have experienced themselves in this country. So we applaud what Connecticut has done and continue to work for and call for other states to follow suit. Ultimately, what that lesson sought to share, and certainly what is gleaned from all the other lessons too, is the need for solidarity at this time. When we say Black Lives Matter, we are not saying that Black lives are the only lives that matter. In fact, it is making that point clear that despite all the proclamations that this country has made, that this is a place for everybody, the African American experience is a criticism of that, because Black lives have not mattered. And so joining in solidarity and proclaiming Black Lives Matter is an important development in this country, and yet is only the first step. As we see in this photo, students on the campus there back in the 60s recognized their relationship to each other, joined in community, articulated their demands, and acted on those demands in a way that now all students are able to benefit. What can we, or how can we as educators and administrators ensure that that history, more than merely be taught in our classrooms, but is lived forward in the establishment of institutions that capture the spirit of what those movements represented, the advancement of a true democracy in our country, a true meritocracy within our educational system. And so it is in that spirit that we conclude our series. We typically here, I would share books that I would encourage you to read if you wanted to continue your learning. We end our series with action steps that we invite you to take. Of course, we want you to continue to read, to study, and to raise your awareness. We also invite you to advance racial justice within your organization. That too is vital. It is not enough. There was a period in which I think one of the weeks after the police murder of George Floyd, where the New York Times bestsellers list contained all works that were either written by Black persons or addressing concerns of racial justice. That was pretty monumental. But as we see, it is not enough just to read. Advancement, social advancement does not occur because people walk around with an awareness. we have to take that awareness and actualize it. Advancing racial justice in your organization is a very simple way to become involved in the pursuit of justice for all. You can also join a local effort. In one of the episodes, we talked about how advancing racial justice at the school board level is essential, that a lot of these issues, when we're talking about public education, are state level concerns. So you would want your state representatives to be made aware of how you think and feel with respect to educational access and equity. You can also donate your time and money to racial justice organizations. And that's very important too. And finally, support the Kaplan Educational Foundation, the good work that they are doing to serve as a bridge, to provide a means for students from disadvantaged communities, however that is understood and defined, to receive the benefit of a 4-year college education is a crucial work that we all should seriously consider supporting. And so with that, I am very pleased to have been your host and educator for this series. And if you are interested in learning more about Origin, the Oceania Racial Justice Initiative, you are invited to check out the website where you can learn more about our work at racial-justice.org. And thank you very much. And continue to do the work, continue to stand